Hey everyone, welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Ray Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
And Paul, today we got to revisit a topic that we did in the past, suicide, but kind of a different approach today. And, lucky to have Dr. David Jobs on with us.
And the previous focus being in schools, and now Dave came on and was talking about CAMS, which is the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. And we had a chance to talk with him about his recent book, Managing Suicidal Risk. It's the third edition of it, and man, just a wealth of information. Yeah. And both in reading the book, but getting to talk with Dave as well. Like it's just I just feel so immensely lucky, like getting the chance because I feel like it's changing my thoughts on suicide and the treatment of it. Yeah.
I ran across Dave, I think about 4 years ago now, and I saw him at a conference, and it really, just in a couple hours, he completely changed what I thought about suicide and how I managed it. And, it's, I think we hear this throughout the show a little bit, but it was, really, he just changed my perspective. And I think kind of my takeaway kind of falls off of that. He actually uses the term that psychotherapy is perspective cultivation. And I think it's a great little comment. And he definitely changed my perspective and how I practice. So, 4 years later, it was great to actually have him on here and actually really talk about this topic. What was your takeaway today?
I think for me, actually, it kind of plays off of what you're saying here, where there's a beauty to the model, like CAMS model, where it's working to build and inspire hope for for the clients we're working with. And I think even early on in the episode, he talks about stability, but there's this other side of it that's kind of goes on untalked about, but it's a great way of building the clinician's confidence and comfort. And, in the episode, we'll get into just how challenging it is for treatment for suicide, and, how this model can really help, provide a path for clinicians to follow that helps to build their confidence, because so often, there's this fear of, liability. There's this fear of losing a client. And this is just kind of a nice way of approaching it and saying, hey, here's an approach that has evidence base, and that it's worth trying out. So it's certainly, I'm very thankful for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was really great. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Dave, Dr. David Jobs is a professor of psychology, associate director of clinical training, and the director of the Suicide Prevention Laboratory at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And I would love to hear your takeaways from this episode. I think both Paul and I kind of always walk away from these things thinking we have learned so much in that hour. So we'd love to hear what you've learned from this episode as well.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Managing Suicidal Risk.
So, Dave, thanks so much for joining us today on the Psych to Practice podcast. We're so glad to have you with us.
Delighted to be here with you guys.
Well, so Paul and I are really excited to kind of talk a little bit about your work. And before we kind of get started, we always like to hear a little bit about the backstory of our guests. So tell us a little bit, how did you get into the field of mental health?
I was thinking about this before. My dad worked in personnel, human resources, back in the 60s and 70s. So that dates me right there. And he was involved in early phase industrial organizational psychology. So he was doing grid seminars and T groups and sensitivity training and things that that were really, sort of on the cutting edge back in those days. and he got Psychology Today. He got the magazine Psychology Today. And so I used to look at that as a kid, as a teenager, and think, this is kind of interesting. So that was a bit of it. And then I went to college at the University of Colorado, and I was a philosophy major. And my favorite professor called me into his office and said, "Get out of philosophy. There's no." And I was lost, and then I was devastated because I imagined myself the next great philosopher. And I was at home in Cleveland during Thanksgiving break, and my best friend's dad, who known me since kindergarten, said, "Well, of course you're going to become a psychologist." It's like, okay. And so I declared my major, and the rest is history, I guess.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. We've had so many people that start in philosophy and then somebody says, yeah, there's no jobs in that. So, but what a great background, though. I think, philosophy's done so much for the field of psychology. It's kind of a great start point. So
one could argue that philosophy is, one of the grandparents of psychology.
Yeah. I would agree. It's so moving into then kind of where you're at in your career now. So, we're familiar with your work around suicide and specifically CAMS. What led you down that path of work? How did you get into the work around suicide?
I was, I went to college in Colorado and was not a very serious student. So I didn't do all the things that one should be doing in college to be competitive for a PhD program, which is what I decided rather late in the game I wanted to pursue. And so I ended up, went back to Cleveland. I worked in a children's hospital. I did research at Case Western Reserve University. I literally went door to door to professors' offices and said, "Can I be a research assistant for you?" And sure enough, a guy took me on. And so I started getting some research experience. And then I got into a master's program at American University here in Washington. And my psychopathology professor was Dr. Lanny Berman, and he was a luminary in the field. And he's now since retired, but he kind of opened the door to the field. And at that time, I got to meet all the founding fathers and mothers of the profession. So I met Ed Steinman and Bob Lippman and Norman Farborough and Marshall Linehan and all these famous people that are now sort of the founders. And that kind of did it for me. I got to meet the founders of my field and got really well mentored, and then discovered my passion. I mean, this field is so compelling, and we'll get into it, I'm sure. But I mean, I people think it's a morbid topic, and I say, we're focused on saving lives and making lives worth living. And what could be more exciting than that in psychology or in anything, from my bias.
Yeah, I would agree. And, it's interesting. I had a chance to see you speak. I guess it's been about maybe 4 years ago now, First National Practice Conference. Oh. And you're the first person that I heard talk the way you do about suicide work, and to really challenge this idea of inpatient hospitalizations and how we think a little different about it. And, it's interesting you said that, it being exciting, because I remember walking out of that going, okay, this is the first time I feel like there's a really hopeful path here. There's a way to think about suicide in a different way. And so I'm so excited to kind of dive into it a little bit and talk about your book. So, I mean, I was excited to see you had a book come out. I've followed some things on your website and the CAMS website and things. So looking forward to kind of diving into that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad that was your takeaway, because that really is the goal, is to really challenge what I would contend is like a medieval mindset about suicide and mental health. Mm-hmm. That this notion that people that are suicidal are crazy. The Latin would be non compos mentis, which means not in their right mind. Yeah. And we had in the 1800s, 1900s, this mindset that if they weren't possessed by the devil, that's where we started. They were, which is probably not much better, but they were crazy, and so they had to be contained and controlled, and sort of forced to come to their senses, which would mean that they would no longer be suicidal. And so that's where we really. There are exceptions, of course, but that's where the modal response to a person that's suicidal is hospitalization and medication. And those interventions actually probably don't help that much and sometimes make things worse.
Yeah. And it's, I think it's one of the things I've found kind of in my career. I think that when we jump to that, we shut down the conversation. So people are so afraid that if I say I have thoughts of suicide, I'm going to go to the hospital. And so then they don't talk. And it's, so I think that when I heard you speak, that was one of the things I was like, wow, this is great, because now we create a dialogue with a person in a different way that they don't have to worry that that's we're going to jump to. So I think it's, it's just a great way to kind of reframe. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about CAMS? Let's maybe kind of just tell us a little bit about that whole approach.
Yeah. So the pillars of CAMS are empathy, collaboration, and honesty, which, seems like it should be true for any psychological treatment. But what you're referring to, Ray, is this mindset of like, I got to get rid of this patient. We got to lock this person up, got to get medication in them, because a lot of clinicians are frightened. And one of the reasons that clinicians are frightened is they don't get trained in what actually is effective to do with a person that's thinking about suicide. What you alluded to is actually been proven empirically that there's evidence that patients in a prior practice study were reluctant to talk about suicide because they were afraid to be thrown in the hospital. And then there's a study that came out later that year showing that clinicians' number one sort of thing to respond to suicide with is hospitalization. And so we're kind of missing each other. We're missing our patients. The patients are missing us. And we're not, as you said, right, having a conversation about suffering, and that people are suicidal for legitimate reasons. And the question of CAMS is, do you have to end your life to get your needs met? And that's meant to be a very respectful question. It's meant to open the door to the patient or client to describe their experience. So a part of CAMS that's sort of famous or infamous is that we sit next to the patient with their permission, because we want to get on the same team. So just like I'm looking at Paul and Ray here, you guys are a team. You're sitting side by side, and that's sort of what we do in CAMS is we try to get out of the adversarial sort of relationship and move into a collaborative relationship. And what facilitates that is a document called the Suicide Status Form, or the SSF, and that's a assessment, treatment planning, tracking, documentation, clinical outcome tool that has 3 different phases. But it's the roadmap that guides the process. We engage around this collaborative deconstruction of who, what, when, where, why do you become suicidal, and then what can you do about it?
And, to go back to that point of just inviting the conversation in, one thing, like, going through the book, like, I think it is in like I believe the first chapter, and it's talking about the informed consent. And, I was reading through that, and I think you even kind of in a self-aware way, like write about it afterwards, about clinicians' responses of how they take the directness and talking about suicide, and, that worry of like, oh, like in some ways it feels like a challenge, because really it's like, there's a finality that comes along with suicide. Why not give this evidence-based practice a try? And I believe even in a later chapter, sharing that piece where you're talking about how because it's evidence-based, we need the buy-in. And so if they have that safety blanket of the stockpile of pills or firearm or whatever that method is, and if they're unwilling to part with that, then, in a way they're saying, I'm not willing to give this, a full buy-in. And like that, like I think I reread there's a little quotation section in the book. I encourage listeners to go and check it out, because I think I read that 3 or 4 times, and I was just like, wow, like such like so powerful. And I think you talk about like trying to put yourself in the perspective of a client sitting next to the clinician talking about this. And, it invites it in a way that makes it real, makes it a topic that we can talk about and work with. And, it's just so valuable.
Well, Paul, what I would say to that is when we give up the illusion of power over the patient, we gain much more influence and leverage. And that's one of the secrets, is that when we acknowledge that this person is capable of killing themselves, and by midnight tonight, 132 Americans will have taken their lives today. about a third of them will have been in treatment with clinicians who don't know how to work with them. And the vast majority then don't want us. So that to me is a real commentary on the state of our field, where upwards of 70% of people that die by suicide don't want mental health care. Yeah. Why is that? Because what they get is something that's not empathic, not collaborative, not validating. And so, I appreciate you and Ray's take on this, because that's exactly the goal, is to sort of flip the tape, flip the script and say, here are the ground rules. I practice in DC, the District of Columbia, and the Mental Health Act of DC and in Maryland, where I live, is very clear that if you're in imminent danger, I have a duty to stop you from hurting yourself. And that might involve putting you in a facility where you can't leave for 24 hours or 36 hours, whatever the jurisdiction requires. I'd rather not do that. Wouldn't you rather not do that? And
right.
Some people want to go to the hospital, and I don't know why, because it's not a very pleasant experience, but with some exceptions, of course. But so we start, trying to look at this through the patient's eyes, just as you said, and that this collaborative seating arrangement is a part of that. And I'm an old Rorschacher, when I first went to the university, I taught the Rorschach, and the Rorschach is ink blots that Hermann Rorschach made up in the early 1900s and showed to schizophrenic patients. And sure enough, they saw really bizarre and peculiar things. When we sit with the patient and go through the suicide status form and really pay attention to what they're saying, the patient gets this like, wow, you actually are listening to me and you actually care about what I'm going through. And so we know the SSF is a therapeutic assessment. And then we have the audacity, as we get into this, we do a stabilization plan, which is important. But the real signature piece of CAMS is we ask the client, what makes you want to kill yourself? And I've never had a patient say the lack of serotonin at the synaptic cluster of my prefrontal, cortex and neurons. They're like, my wife left me. My kids don't talk to me. I hate what I do. I'm foreclosing on my house. That's what people talk about who are suicidal, and that's what we target and treat in CAMS.
And kind of going through the book, and I should even just call it again, like the book is such a great resource, and the way it reads, it feels like you're hearing the background of like the development, the conceptualization there. But it also feels like just such a great tool. And, I spent quite a bit of time in the appendix flipping back and forth and just kind of really grounding myself. And I think it was Carmen's example of like, what that looks like. And the suicide status form, I love those the 6 areas or the 6, initial kind of perceptions that you were talking about. And I guess for our listeners, like, do you mind kind of covering like what those 6 areas are initially? And then I know there's multiple steps and sections in the SSF, but it really stood out.
So Paul, you're referring to what we call the core assessment, and that's simply rating your psychological pain and stress and agitation, and your hopelessness and self-hatred and your overall risk of suicide. And it's just a simple 6-step assessment that every session of CAMS, right to the resolution and outcome, starts with. So the patient gets familiar with it. It becomes a working model. In session 4, the patient will come in and say, well, I had a really great week this week and my pain is way down, but then my girlfriend, threatened to leave me. So my hopelessness spiked, and, it becomes something that's really valuable. Patients always get a copy of their SSF. So in one of our Army studies, we had a soldier who would go home and put his SSF on the refrigerator and call his wife over, and he would go through the treatment plan update, of his drivers, and the stabilization plan, which is our version of a safety plan that's baked into the CAMS model. And we love this guy. He was so into it, and we bring his wife in, and she was really supportive. He got in a debate with his clinician about whether his direct drivers were really indirect drivers, and he was actually right, and his clinician was wrong. But what was so cool about it was that he was becoming his own suicidologist.
Yeah.
And in CAMS, we teach the patient to become their own suicidologist, to understand that they're on their way to getting into trouble, which typically means that their limbic system and their amygdala is activated and their brain is on fire. And what's bad about that is that the prefrontal cortex shuts down. And we need this part of the brain because that's what sort of our judgment and our executive functioning and our empathy. A lot of good stuff is offline. So if we can teach the patient that I'm getting into trouble, I should use my stabilization plan, or I should talk to my friend Ray, or I should, call the National Lifeline or text line, then we're doing things that basically re-engage the prefrontal cortex to downregulate that part of the brain that's got overactivated in that fight or flight mode. So all of the evidence-based interventions basically do the same thing. They teach patients what Aaron Beck referred to as a suicidal mode. There's other names for it, but they teach patients when I'm getting in trouble and then what I should do instead. And it works. It seems super simple, but it's actually a game changer. And in CAMS, one of the things that's very unique about CAMS is we don't eradicate every vestige of a suicidal thought. We just help the patient learn to manage those thoughts and manage those feelings and achieve something that I think is highly underrated, which is behavioral stability. So we're not necessarily angling for a cure. We're angling for management and stability. And we finish off the intervention focused on what would make your life worth living. And I'm 65 and I'm looking at the last several years of my career here, and I'm really fascinated with what makes life worth living, what gives each of us a sense of purpose and meaning, and how do we understand, what makes it worth getting up in the morning? Because it's not enough just to survive. We would rather have people flourish and thrive, and not everybody can do that. But if they've been suicidal and they've walked to that brink, we will to back them away from that brink, so to speak, then it does open the door to possibilities. And that's the single biggest effect of CAMS, is increasing hope and decreasing hopelessness, which is a super cool finding that we're excited about.
Yeah. And, it's, you use the word stabilization plan. And I have to say, I'm sure that was very intentional in your, but what a different change of thought, moving from a safety plan, which feels like somebody's putting on you, versus a stabilization plan that somebody teams with you. And so is that simple just change of word. And I remember the first time that I either heard you say it or maybe I've read that terminology. And I have found that patients respond to that when you don't use as simple as this, just that simple word change, and say, listen, our goal is stabilization here. This isn't, a safety thing. Because I think, again, safety cues, you're gonna lock me up. That's how you're going to keep me safe. And stabilization gives that, okay, we're going to give you some skills so that you can manage this. And I love that you reference about, I'm going to keep this in mind, about them being their own suicidologists. Like, that, because what an empowering, just that simple kind of movement. What an empowering thing for people. That's great.
Yeah, it's a nuanced thing, but it's actually a big deal, right?
Big deal. Yeah.
Because we've now done interviews with people who lived experience, and we've asked them about safety planning. And, many of them are very positive about it. It's certainly better than what I grew up with, which was no harm contracts.
Yeah.
Promise me you won't kill yourself or I'll block you
I
up.
remember those. Right.
Right. People still use them.
Yeah.
So I gotta say, people still use them and think, oh yeah, that's the state of the art. And it's not. It's been proven to be ineffective in 3 randomized controlled trials. But the thing about stabilization is we had this interview with this one woman who said, yeah, I did one after my first attempt, and it felt very paternalistic and pejorative. Like, we know you're going to F up. So when you do, you need this thing. So I need for you to be safe for me. And she said that was what landed with her. And she felt controlled and disrespected. Now, that's not how Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown want people to do safety planning. but it's oftentimes how it's done. Mm-hmm. And because people are afraid, and including clinicians. So clinicians have a hard time with this because they're afraid. They don't want to lose the patient. They don't want to be sued for malpractice, wrongful death. So there's a lot of fear that goes into clinician actions that doesn't help the patient. So when you flip the script and say, I can't stop you from killing yourself, but you are here with me now. Why wouldn't we do this? You can always kill yourself later. But if you're going to kill yourself in an imminent kind of way, I got to stop you. And that's what we mean in CAMS by honesty and transparency, is that, why wouldn't we lay all that out to give the patient or the client actual choices?
And I don't know if this is something you've ever looked into, but do you think that part of why clinicians kind of take this power approach sometimes with it is because of their own fear? It's like, I'm afraid this is going to happen, so we're going to control the situation. I'm going to, I almost see it almost as parents. When parents feel ill-equipped, and they do these really harsh things that don't work. And it's almost like, I almost feel the same way with clinicians, is they're so afraid that that's guiding them making bad decisions.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's very paradoxical and very problematic because out of fear, clinicians do these controlling things. And what I think about is like, can you imagine going, I survived cancer recently and I'm 100% cancer free. And so this is near and dear to me. Can you imagine having, like, for women, breast cancer or colorectal cancer, a form of cancer that where tens of thousands of people die, just like suicide, and having a provider say, I don't do any of the evidence-based stuff for the last 30 years. I kind of like the old stuff that we've been doing for 200 years. You'd be mortified.
Yeah.
Right.
You'd be mortified. And so one of the developments that I'm really excited about is that we submitted a paper to the journal American Psychologist, which for psychology is a high impact journal. It's the big APA journal. And I actually expected a desk rejection because I just don't feel like there's a receptivity for these views. And basically it was that we have an ethical and professional obligation to embrace evidence-based approaches. They've been around for 30 years. And we really don't have an excuse. And not only was it not desk rejected, it got one of the best reviews I've ever received for a journal article.
Wow.
And I'm happy about that, but I'm excited because I think it reflects a kind of a tipping point where of receptivity that I don't think used to exist. And this is me being guardedly hopeful about, shows like this and an article like that, or looking at these things in this sort of contrary way, has the potential to decrease a lot of human suffering. 16.6 million Americans have serious thoughts of suicide.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the population of Manhattan, New York City. Double it. And you're talking about how many people have serious thoughts of suicide in the United States in 2022. This is all SAMHSA data. It's robust data. It's 300 times greater than the number of people who die by suicide. And yet, we don't think about suicidal ideation as a problem. In the UK, United Kingdom, you can only get dialectical behavior therapy if you make an attempt. If you only have suicidal thoughts, you get supportive counseling. So my friends there say that's operant conditioning to have people ramp up to an attempt behavior so they get DBT, which is actually an incredibly effective treatment. It just makes no sense. So this is the fight. This is why I'm so happy to be on your show, is just to say, this makes no sense. Yeah. We've got better ways to do this. Let's get over the fear and embrace our competency. And with competency comes confidence, and with confidence, patients change. And that's what it takes.
And really, in a different way, but maybe just as effective, I hear CAMS is as much of a stabilization plan for the clients as it is for the clinicians, and being able to use it as a resource where they can feel confident. They can feel like, okay, when I'm afraid or when I feel unsure, here, again, this is evidence-based approach that I can rely on, that has support and has research out there that I can turn to that, that can reproduce it, the effects of it. And so, such a valuable thing. And, certainly as you're sharing and talking, I'm thinking about my own, just different trainings through, graduate program. And we talked about suicide, but suicide was, it wasn't this main focus. And one thing I really appreciate about CAMS is, the way that it's framed as I believe in the book you named it as non-denominational, and it's only for suicide. We're not trying to, maybe there's adaptability, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to, the point of CAMS is to decrease those the suicidal ideation and increasing hope. And, I think it's absolutely brilliant.
Well, we kind of backed clinicians into becoming comfortable with this topic.
Yeah.
And so you really pick up on that subtly, Paul, which I appreciate, that it is about managing the suicidal risk for the client, but it's also managing the clinician's anxiety as well. When I was first in the field, I wrote this chapter with this very famous guy, John Malzberger, and it was called "The Hazards of Working with Suicidal Risk." And I had this thing that I wrote about empathic fortitude that I thought was so clever. And the therapist voyeur, who's on the outside looking in, all very professional, but not really engaged. And but with empathic fortitude, we could become a therapist participant. And I just love this. And I would go and present to people, and they'd be like, "Yeah, no," it just empathic fortitude, like when in one ear and out the other. And so I think quite literally, in sort of getting someone to sit down next to the patient and then look at this document, it's a stimulus field, but it also puts us on the same team, and the patient feels very validated and very taken seriously. And they get copies of these documents, and and at the end of every session, we go back to your treatment plan and say, "Okay, Paul, your drivers are, that you are socially isolated, and that and your substance abuse issues. Are these still your issues, or do we need to modify these?" So you're a co-author of your own treatment plan, and so it really mixes things up, especially with the expectations that are out there, as you guys have been alluding to. It's so much better than what is typical. And it's in some ways so simple, which is kind of the beauty of it. It's just like really listening to somebody who suffers in this way is the most therapeutic thing you can do. And not getting rid of them is also super therapeutic. And if we made it a therapy, then the analyst wouldn't like it, or the cognitive therapist wouldn't like it. So the idea of making a framework was compelling, because then you could be an analyst, or you could be Rogerian, or you could primal scream. We don't really care what your theoretical bent is or what techniques you use, as long as you're using the framework and treating drivers. And patients like it. I had a student who's training at a clinic here in DC, and she was asked to do a presentation on CAMS for the staff. And one of the senior clinicians was like, "Oh, that's so cold and harsh." And she's like, "What?" It's the opposite of cold. It was cold and rigid. Yeah. And people think of the forms as being this rigid thing, and they think of CAMS only as assessment. It's a full-blown grown-up treatment.
Yeah.
7 randomized controlled trials and 2 meta-analyses supporting it. And so people are not up to speed. They don't necessarily, they might be still in the first edition. That third edition that you're referring to really is the capstone of the intervention and of the work that I've done in this. And the other thing you alluded to, I'm kind of going on here, but the other thing you alluded to, my editor at Guilford really wanted me to write the book in the first person. And I initially resisted that. And I was like, that's not how an academic writes. It's always third person. He was 100% right. And I think what you alluded to, and the readability of it, and a lot of the self-disclosures I make, and the case examples, really helps the cause and makes clinicians perhaps a little bit more comfortable with the whole concept of working with this issue this way.
And Not sure. I don't recall seeing it, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. But is there any data on clinicians' rating of comfort in engaging with clients with suicide kind of prior to and then after going through the treatment process with CAMS and then being able to use it and experience it, with clients? Like, is there any data there that shows their confidence and comfort there with engaging with the topic?
Yeah, there's actually multiple studies. There was a study in Georgia about people engaged in CAMS training and how much more confident and competent they felt. There's a study that we did, it was published in Journal of Affective Disorders, about clinicians feeling significantly more confident and competent in using CAMS. There's a fair amount of clinician data over the years. And, and what I find really exciting, we have 3 randomized controlled trials going right now, funded by NIMH, and that started pre-COVID. And one of the things is that we've now been able to do CAMS online. We have a fillable PDF of the SSF, and we can do it on DoxyMe or Zoom or whatever secure platform a clinician uses. It works great. The clinician is now the scribe, and the patient sees exactly what you're putting on their SSF, and they still get a copy. They love correcting the clinician. Which is fun to watch. But the other thing I was going to say about that is that we see the comfort that clinicians get in sort of having something that works, mostly through the reactions of the patients and how positive the patients are. So we started out these trials with licensed providers, like in this campus trial, 4 university counseling centers. Now 100%, maybe one exception, of the clinicians are people in training. Our VA randomized control trial was 100% graduate students, and they're great. They believe in evidence. They don't want to screw up, and they want to be competent, and they don't have attitudes like my age do. So we love training young clinicians because they're just all about
it. I think I remember, I don't know if you had said this or you guys have tried one with an avatar as well, right? Isn't there a Dr. David Jobs avatar existing out there somewhere?
There's a Dr. Dave avatar that got phased out.
It is phased out, okay.
Yeah, because the people that have experience are like, get rid of the old white guy. So avatars are very expensive. So this is the Jasper. This is the Jasper Health intervention. That's a immersive environment-based intervention where a lot of elements of CAMS are part of this tablet engagement, and the relational agents are called Jasper, and a little cartoon person called Jasper, and a woman of color named Jazz. And it's a menu driven experience where you get a lot of the SSF assessment, but you also can watch puppies playing, or learn about diaphragmatic breathing, or tune into stories that people have experienced, telling you about how they recovered. And so we've done 2 NIMH funded grants. The Dr. Dave was the proof of concept study, and it went well. But this is the Jasper intervention is much more robust, and patients like it better. And what's interesting about it is, how much do people like being in the emergency department? Not at all. How long do they wait to see their doctor? 8, 15, 24, ordered overnight hours, and so while they're sitting there, why not let them engage with this intervention? And what they like, they can download on their smartphone. So it's been a really cool line of research. Linda DeMeff and Kelly Kerner were the collaborators and we're still doing research with it. And it's a part of the solution, because ED visits are miserable, and they're typically not very therapeutic for mental health patients in particular.
Do you, I know this is a little outside of CAMS, but, I keep reading things about these kind of AI interventions as a screening, or maybe a starting point for someone who is, maybe feeling like they're going to make an attempt, or whatever it might be. What are your thoughts around that use of technology as a starting point in the intervention process?
I am open and supportive of anything that's going to help the cause. So I'm not just CAMS. I'm ambassador to the field of what works. So our training company has webinars. I just had Matt Knock on from Harvard, and Matt's all about technologies and ecological inventory assessment, which are assessments that are done on your phone.
Yeah.
There's a number of chatbots and there's a number of technologies that are being developed along these lines. 16.6 million Americans with serious thoughts of suicide. We've got to do something, and we will never have enough clinicians. So I'm a big fan of peer-based interventions, of paraprofessional models. I've been known to advocate a mental health service corps, which would be like a mental health peace corps type of movement. And the technologies, it's not the solution, but it's a part of the solution, I'm convinced.
Yeah. I kind of feel the same way. I think it's great to see that there are people thinking outside the box to try anything. Because as we live in an area in Pennsylvania where we're in a shortage. I mean, I know there's a national shortage, but we're struggling to get people in any way that we can kind of intervene earlier. I think is a wonderful option.
Matt Knock, for example, did this really cool study on a platform called Coco. And when people post provocative messages about maybe being suicidal, there's a sort of an automatic intervention, and a lot of social media platforms are sort of working with, giving the 988 number or the national text line number. And Matt did this really cool study where they created an automated way of saying, okay, Ray, it sounds like you're not doing too great. Here's the National Lifeline number. And you would then have that resource. And then they would follow up and say, are you going to call? And like most Americans, you'd say, no. And you say, why aren't you going to call? Well, I don't want the police coming. The police only come in 1% of the calls, of all the calls to the National Lifeline. So, and they were actually able to demonstrate that people actually increased their calling behavior through an algorithm.
Wow.
And following up, just sort of like pushing, sort of the common questions or common pushback. And you think about it, clinicians, like without thinking twice about it, will leave, the Lifeline number on their recording, their
right.
recording for their office. Or take yourself to the nearest emergency room. Emergency rooms are not therapeutic, and most people are not going to call the Lifeline. But good to go. Left that message on my phone, and it's better to do that than nothing. But it doesn't map onto what people who are suicidal need and are actually going to do.
So I just want to make sure I'm hearing this right. Then, so that program you were saying. It was the fact that they gave them the information that 1% actually the police come that changed calling behavior.
That's one anecdote from that, but they had a number of like, what is your reason for not calling the Lifeline? And they had sort of factual based information to give back to you. So it was a couple of interactions, but it was all computer driven, and it changed behavior.
I mean, what a powerful thought. I mean, even just for clinicians, it goes back to how we started, right? I mean, if the person fears that that's what's going to be the outcome, we shut down the conversation. And that's amazing. And I've never heard that research. It's super interesting.
He does a lot of really clever things. So, I mean, that's
really cool.
That to me is exciting. And so, and we need all of it, and so that's why, I really do talk about the other interventions and not just CAMS. CAMS is the best intervention for the biggest problem, which is the 16.6 million.
Yeah.
But the other interventions are better with attempt behaviors. We've got some attempt data, but we need to replicate that data. And there's an interesting bifurcation of the proven treatments, like dialectical behavior therapy or the cognitive therapy interventions that are suicide focused. They reliably reduce attempt and self-harm behaviors, but they don't move the needle on ideation. Where CAMS always moves the needle on ideation, attachment-based family therapy reduces ideation, but doesn't necessarily reliably reduce attempt behaviors. So I've written a paper, one size doesn't fit all. I mean, we really do need to match different treatments to different kinds of populations. And we are in a place where that is possible. We just have to have the will and the administrations and the systems of care buy into that model. I'm working on an editorial with Julie Goldstein Grummet, who's the leader of the Zero Suicide movement. And Zero Suicide has been this very successful policy initiative to raise standards of care for suicide risk across systems of care. There are 12 components. The treat component is largely ignored. There's good leadership. There's the pathway. There's screening. There's safety planning. There's postvention. But treat, they just kind of skip over the treat. I did a Columbia. I gave them a safety plan. We're good. And that is a good start. But that doesn't treat what makes this person consider ending their life, which is to me, it's the fatality of our fields. How can we not be about that? And yet, as we've been discussing it, a lot of clinicians just don't want to go there.
Yeah. And, we kind of used the term earlier, but we're wanting to connect that to the treatment process, which is the drivers. And really that was, reading through and recognize familiarizing with the CAMS model, that was that focus of if we can understand and identify and then understand the drivers empathically, then we can work, again, engaging that prefrontal cortex in terms of the problem solving and really working to say, how do we change this and create a measure of hope in them? And I guess with that, would you mind kind of sharing just a little bit with our listeners, those drivers, how does that identification really kind of shine with the treatment process, the connection between those two?
Yeah, I love this concept because for people who are suicidal, they say they feel driven.
Yeah.
Psychologically driven to do this. And it's not under their control. And so one of the things that we know about that is that so much that driver content is relational by far.
Yeah.
It's the number one kind of driver that we see. There's a fair amount of, we published a paper last year on this, a fair amount of vocational struggle. People hating what they do, how they spend their time, how they make their living, get by in life. There's some measure of suffering and struggle. And what's interesting about treating drivers is you do not have to treat them and eliminate them. You just have to make some progress.
Yeah.
And with progress, there's hope. And where there's hope, anything's possible. And so that's the thing that I really am excited about is that we did a study in Switzerland looking at reasons for living and reasons for dying, thinking that reasons for living were protective factors. And this is a 2-year follow-up, and reasons for living didn't do anything in predicting outcomes. It was all about reasons for dying.
Wow.
So, okay, let's regroup. Let's think about, so a person coming in for their first session who's just made a suicide attempt in this case, they don't want to hear about reasons for living. In fact, if you push reasons for living on me, that's an empathic failure of what I'm going through. That's your agenda, not mine. I'm focused on the dying.
Yeah.
So if you dial to that with me and you can tolerate it and be there with me, that's really helpful. And then as we start to make a little therapeutic traction on your drivers, we see hope absolutely take off. And in the meta-analysis of the 9 CAMS trials that came out in 2021, decreasing hopelessness and increasing hope was the single biggest effect size of CAMS. And I just love that finding because, I want to drop ideation and symptom distress and attempt behaviors and the things that we've been able to do. But I love that this is a treatment for hope because that is what makes the world go round. And for people who are suicidal, it is not where they are. It's not what they can muster. But with just a little bit of progress, boom, they can get on the hope train and they can ride that train out of the hell they're in.
I got a great subtitle for the book, managing suicidal risk, a treatment for hope. In reading through it, it comes through. It feels, as someone who I've heard of the CAMS model. I can't say that it was something I was very familiar with before, going to the 3rd edition here. And it it sparked that interest. It was like, wow, like, okay, what a different approach, because there was fear. There was a lot of insecurity there, and working to say, okay, we can have a greater sense of confidence as clinicians, and we can inspire a greater sense of hope for our clients. And what clinician doesn't like inspiring hope?
One of my greatest compliments is when people say, "Oh, you haven't invented anything new. That's just good social work. Or that's just good psychology." And I don't dispute that. I think psychotherapists and counselors who get it love this model because it just feels intuitive, and it feels like that it's something that they've been doing ever since they were in the field. And I love those people, and they can readily embrace it. But for a lot of people, this is such a scary topic. For a lot of clinicians, it's such a scary topic, and they just rather get rid of the patient. And yet, if we can kind of like hit the pause button and sort of look at that and sort of peel away what's behind the fear, mind you, if the fear is around liability, the SSF is your armor for any litigation, because documentation is what makes tort litigation for malpractice go around. So you are documenting extensively the work in session with the patient. The patient's got a copy of their SSF. You're doing it during the session, so it's kind of all done as part of the treatment. And there's a little bit additional documentation after the session that takes 2 or 3 minutes. And that's your bulletproof. And you're bulletproof from malpractice, more or less, because you didn't fail to assess, you didn't not treat this issue, and you didn't drop the ball, because we're tracking the risk until it resolves.
I think the other piece of, and we've kind of maybe said this, but I also think this model gives people permission, meaning clinicians, permission to talk about it instead of solving it, and to be comfortable in, talking about the drivers. And, I thought it was interesting when you said that jumping to trying to get people to focus on why they want to live, how that's actually therapeutically counterintuitive. We really need to actually talk about the fact that they want to die and what those drivers are. And I think that's a great point of Cam's. Is I almost feel like it gives permission for us to stay there with the patient for a minute and to listen, and then they feel understood, and we don't have to try to solve it immediately. That's not the goal. It's that connection. And we say this, doing this podcast for a while, I always feel it keeps coming back to connection. It's like almost everything we talk about, it comes back to, what a great fundamental. But even in this case, how important it is to just be with that person, and it's okay to be in a bad place with that person initially.
It's hard to tolerate until you discover that you can do it,
right?
And then you wonder why you never did it before, because it's so
exposure.
Right? Yeah, it is. And so that is Paul's point earlier. It is a bit of a double entendre. When we talk about managing suicidal risk, it's managing. It's certainly managing the risk in the patient, but it's managing the anxiety in the clinician as well.
Yeah. So Dave, I wish we could spend all day talking about this, and I appreciate you taking time to just give us kind of a starting point. But in making sure we're keeping with your time as well, we like to kind of wrap up our episodes and kind of just get some tidbits and some takeaways for our guests. And so we usually end with kind of 3 questions. And the one, and I think maybe I even know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. What keeps you psyched to do what you do, to keep you motivated to do this line of work?
Well, I always tell my students we're in the life-saving business, and it's a pretty cool thing. And the Suicide Prevention Lab at Catholic U, where I am, the students are on fire for this stuff, and it really feels like we're doing something special. And I've even kind of expanded my thinking about this, or evolved it, where I'm less focused on preventing suicides. I'll always be about that, but I'm much more focused on the suffering. I'm much more focused on this massive population of people that have these serious thoughts of suicide within 30 days of the SAMHSA survey. And those are the people that we can best treat with this intervention. And then, I think the other thing that keeps me going is that in studying suicide, it may sound crazy, but I learned so much about life. And so I'm teaching a new undergraduate course called The Psychology of Life next year. And a lot of it, the first 4 classes are about suicide.
Right.
Because, when you study why people want to give up on life, you learn a lot about what makes life worth living. And when you have a treatment that helps save lives, you learn a lot about sort of what that bridge to the other side looks like. And so I really am fascinated with this topic, and probably have one more book in me to write about the psychology of life.
Awesome. We also like to kind of get one piece of media, whether it's a book, TV show, movie. If there's one that you could recommend listeners to check out other than your own, what would it be?
I am really keen on a book by Matt Haig called The Midnight Library. And it's a great read. He's an amazing writer. He's a person who almost took his life in Spain. He was literally on a cliff about to jump and walk back and recovered. And The Midnight Library is about possible lives. It's got a suicide theme in the front end, so that's a hook for me. But The Midnight Library is all the possible lives that we could live. Every book is a different life we could live.
Oh, awesome.
And I find good psychotherapy is perspective cultivation. The Midnight Library is a book that really gets you thinking about the possibilities of life, and that if you don't like your life, you could live a different life. And it's not just like snapping your fingers, but it does make you think, and it does make you like reconsider your choices and how to live intentionally. And that's a big thing that is important to me.
I've never read it, but I want to put it on my list. That sounds great. Yeah, that's great. I
got another one though. Can I say?
Yeah.
There's another book I just finished called Desperate Remedies, Psychiatry Search for a Cure. It's a fascinating read about the history of mental health care and psychiatry, and how wealthy families who had mentally ill loved ones would pay anything for a cure. And so it just walks you through the sordid history of the asylum movement and psychoanalysis and the ice pick lobotomies. And I'm just fascinated with that history, and just think it's very telling to where we are today, and very much with regard to what I think about in terms of hospitalization and so forth in a contemporary sense.
Awesome. Last question we like to ask, if you could give kind of new clinicians or those listening kind of maybe 3 gems that you've learned in your career, what are those 3 things?
Find a great mentor. I had a great mentor in graduate school, and then Marshall Linehan took me under her wing and dragged me into the field of treatment research, but made all the difference for me. It sounds corny, but I would seek the truth.
Yeah.
When I was a psych tech worker at an inpatient unit, I had people sign no harm contracts, and I thought, this is stupid. But I did it anyway.
Right.
And all these years later, I get to criticize it and offer something better. So I was, just honesty is in CAMS because it's a big part of being a good psychotherapist. I had a professor, this very famous lady. She was elderly, and in the seminar, she's like, "Oh, you young people, you just don't appreciate that honesty is one of the most important things in psychotherapy." And we're all like frantically writing down, honesty is important in psychotherapy. But now, all these years later, she was right. Honesty is really huge. I guess the third thing would be, really seek out work, love, and play, and to try to live intentionally. To me, that's what I've learned from studying suicide is to value my relationships, the importance of my work and what that does for me, and then the importance of being able to play well. to pursue an intentional life, to me, is a life worth living.
And I think that is a very powerful wrap up. That's a great one.
Yeah.
That's a great one. Dave, we can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and learning about CAMS in the brief time. And I'm excited to see the third edition of your book. I will say personally, loved having the conversation, and professionally, you've changed the way I do my work, and that's always a wonderful thing. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, Paul and Ray, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you this evening.
Absolutely.
Once again, certainly a huge thank you, Dave, for joining us on today's episode. And, for our listeners interested in learning more, where can they follow you, or, just kind of keep track of what you're working on? Any area that you can point our listeners to.
Yeah, the lab website at Catholic U. So if you go to the psychology department at Catholic University of America in DC, there's a link to me, a link to my lab, and you can kind of see a bit about what we do, our projects, the students, and so forth. There's a company called CAMS Care, which is a training company that we founded almost 10 years ago, next month. And it's cams-care.com. And that is a resource for CAMS, but also for other things in the field. All the webinars that we've recorded are free and downloadable. Lots of free good stuff there. And then the third thing I would say is I've been, ironically, coming full circle, I've become a blogger for Psychology Today. And nice. So I've done two blogs, maybe three, I can't remember. It's a really cool forum. And, I feel like it's a bigger audience, and I get to sort of spout off on some of these things. And so you can look for me on the Psychology Today website, or track those blogs down if you want to.
Wonderful. I'll personally be doing that myself. So absolutely. And if you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on for Psych to Practice, you can visit our website at www.psychtopractice.com, or follow us on all major social media by searching Psych to Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well and stay psyched.